all I'm going to say, we're listening to WDRT 91.9 FM in Viroqua, and it is our pleasure to have here tonight Mr. Michael Perry, award-winning author. I understand many, many awards, so many awards, the likes of which we may never see. He's an author, he's a musician, he's a farmer. He's a guy that is a philosopher at heart, but yet knows the inner workings of the manure spreader and the pitchfork. He has a deep understanding of the human character and really represents the great state of Wisconsin in so many ways. He's the host of Tent Show Radio, which you might hear if you turn the dial a little bit to the left. And he's here tonight to talk about, a number of things, but he's going to be performing at the Temple Theater coming up here in a couple weeks. Mr. Michael Perry, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you, Eddie. It's been a while since I've seen you.
Yeah, it has. It has. You sent your book. It's the new book is called 40 Acres Deep, and I got it yesterday, and I read it last night, and I read it this morning, and I read it this afternoon, and I just finished it like about 20 minutes before the show, and it blew me away. And we played the song that goes along with it the other week. We'll play it again at this interview, at the end of the interview. But tell me a little bit about this book, how it falls into your writing career so far, and why you picked this book to sort of make a music video that complemented it.
Man, I don't know where to start, and I'm just really glad that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we have time to talk, so I don't have to keep an eye on the clock. I can give you an answer that ranges a little bit, because everything you just said made me think of 16 things. You used the term writing career, and I really struggle with that word career sometimes, because I was raised by parents who tried to instill charity and humility into their children, and I hope that I've retained that, but I also can't escape the fact that I've wound up making a living in an endeavor that does require me to promote myself and to try to sell my work. And when I decided many years ago to go freelance and then eventually wound up with a family to support, I don't have anything out there that I didn't work really hard on and put my heart into, but I do obviously have to make sure ultimately that I'm paying the bills. And I joked up until recently that I've got two daughters, one's in college and one's in braces. that entails a certain income requirement. The one is out of college now and the other one's out of her braces. But all of this rambling just to say that I just feel so lucky. When I get up in the morning, the first thing I want to do is write. I just can't believe I get away with it. But having said that, when I had the idea for 40 Acres Deep, I hesitated, and I talked to mentors and friends, and I even sent the manuscript out to some farmers and some folks who work in ag mental health and some trusted editors. And I don't usually do that. I usually just work with whoever I'm working with, and when the book is done, it's done, and you move on to the next one. But the reason for that was I do have a career, and I do have to write stuff that will eventually, I hope, sell. And this one I wasn't sure about. And even more than that, I was concerned that I might be speaking on something I have no right to speak on, because it's a heavy book. It's a dark book. When I'm being silly in public, I say, well, there's not a lot of zippity-doo-dah in that book. And that's a tip of the cap to Steve Earle, who once said Townes Van Zandt. Something about Townes Van Zandt writes all the great songs and everything else is just zippity-doo-dah. But I just really, struggle is too dramatic a word, but I really chewed it over and over, and because it is a dark book and it's about dark things. But then eventually I just went ahead and did it, and man, it has hit. It's connected. We couldn't get the big publishers interested. That's not a catty comment. That's not a complaint. I understand how they do business and why they do business, and I still work with them when the project is right. But in this case, we just wound up doing it ourselves. Locally. They're printed locally. If you buy one off my website, it's printed locally. I hired a local editor. I work with a local a family down the road from me out in the country that does some distribution. They mail them out. And in the end, after all that waffling and worrying, I'm just so glad I did it. And I got to stop talking and let you do a follow-up. So the last thing I'll say is that the other thing that was really a joy for me, a deep joy for me with this book. I love humor. I do a lot of humor. I'm kind of known for that. And I just did an event yesterday in Colby, Wisconsin, where Colby cheese comes from, and they gave me a chunk of it when I left. But, I just told a bunch of really fun stories, the dead cow story, the beer tent story, and I love that. I love in this day and age to have a group of folks together in a small town auditorium and we're all laughing together. But the thing that brought me here was just a love of words and cadence and rhythm, and what Dylan Thomas said about choosing words for their taste over their meaning. And the one other thing, despite all the heavy, serious stuff I wanted to write about in this book, I also wanted to let myself just not worry about whether it was funny or if it fit a certain market. I just wanted to write scenes that were the kind of scenes that got me into writing in the first place. Like there's a scene where he goes out on a moonlit night, and out in the snow he just sees these black dots, and they run around and they converge and they disappear in a line into the trees. Well, that's because one night I stepped out to shut my chickens in the coop, and it was deer out in the field, and the way they all converged and disappeared into the trees. I just wanted to write that scene. And so I got to stop. Can you tell sometimes they pay me by the word? But I just wanted to, thank you for putting in the effort to read that book. It is a novella, longer than a short story, shorter than a novel. But I wanted to thank you for putting the time in, and then I hope that I expressed kind of what I hoped I could accomplish with that little book.
Yeah, well, it's really a masterpiece. It is dark, but it does maintain your humor, and the language, I agree that it felt like you allowed yourself to have a little more creative freedom using odd words and philosophical concepts that, maybe a farming community might not, catch on to right away. I mean, you use the word ennui twice, which is one of my favorite words. Did you feel that you had to write this book because of the issues of mental health around agriculture and around the farming community, which you're so attached to up there near Eau Claire?
Well, yes and no. I mean, part of my being tentative about it was because, you said, did I have to write about it? I was wondering, do I even have a right to write about it? Because I'm not losing my farm. I'm not suicidal. But I've watched, I'm a kid who grew up in dairy country in the 70s and 80s, and I remember, when I was a little kid, every 120-acre patch was a dairy farm. And, I watched a lot of that disappear in the 80s, and then now recently we just seen another big wave. And so I don't want to pretend that I can channel someone else's desperation, but I did feel like, you don't see a lot of work that really tries to be artful. Hanging out, I don't know how to phrase this, but I have the great pleasure of circulating occasionally through the literary scene that I refer to as the cool kids. And some of those folks are just amazing talents. And I despair over all the tribalism. And so I can easily tell you funny stories about New York people making assumptions about us that are ludicrous, and they're fun stories, and I tell some of them in my readings. But I also rush to point out that those people also are really good at what they do. Some of them are amazing artists, and they've changed my life. But having said that, you sometimes read their attempts to portray our difficulties in the heartland, and there are just little phrases, little notes, little observations that ring false, not because they're not good at what they do, but because they're not living here. And so ultimately I just thought, I can at least do my best to convey what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, people that I know. And so that was what finally kind of helped me go ahead. But then the other thing, you said, did I feel like I had to write this on behalf of the farmers? Yeah, definitely. I want a farmer to be able to read this, and even if I do use a word like ennui, I don't assume that a farmer doesn't know what that means, because I know plenty of farmers who do. But B, if for some reason this person has not read another book in the last 20 years, I hope that despite my attempts to use words like ennui, they absolutely recognize themselves in the character. If I talk about my old truck not starting until I whack the solenoid with a hammer, I read that line. I read it yesterday, and there were 3 or 4 murmurs in the crowd where you just go, yeah, there's someone out there who knows about whacking the solenoid with a hammer. And so what I'm also trying to do is write a book that if you are someone who has an MFA, or you are someone who listens to NPR in the suburbs, and you like literature, well, I like literature too, and so I'm hoping that I can create some literature that's worth your time, that earns your time, but also can convey a real boots-on-the-ground experience. And then at the end of the day, it does again come back to humility, like my dad tried to teach me, and offering it up with some humility and knowing that life has a way of humbling you anyway. So,
well, I've never been a farmer, but I've tried the homestead routine, and it seemed like every page that I read, there was something like that, hitting the solenoid with the hammer to get the car started or the tractor. So many moments of anybody who's been out on a farm, who's had animals or chickens or pigs or cows, just gets. Did you feel like how to say this? I mean, agriculture is such a critical thing, and since we were kids, it has transformed completely. Like our parents and our grandparents wouldn't recognize it. And you repeat that sort of theme in the book of technology and how it's affecting what used to be hands in the dirt, but is now fingers on a touch screen. I don't want to sound dour, but how do you see the evolution of agriculture? Is it over? I mean, did we blow it, or is the regenerative, organic, small farm, really enough of a movement to balance out what's been lost?
Well, man, I don't know, but I don't think there's any question we're in a bit of a pickle. I would say that, another thing that made me nervous about this book, I can give you 3 examples. One is there's a thing in there about orthopedic surgeons who are into getting back to the land and buying up farmland and putting big houses on it. And then there's a scene where I talk about a woman in yoga tights directing this guy on how to do her prairie restoration patch. And, my reservation there is that my wife teaches yoga, and my neighbor is an orthopedic surgeon who's done just that. And he's a good dude. He's doing all kinds of restoration on his own. But it's kind of like I have a song I do where when I introduce it, I go, if anything here offends you, just hang in there. We get around to everybody. And so there's that gentle implication of all of us in this. And then the other big one was, there's a scene where the big farmer, this little farmer has done what so many finally turn to. He's leased his land out to this giant farmer. And, my brother has done that. My dad has done that. And so I also know some of the giant farmers, and they're working a system as well. So as far as how it's all going to pan out, I don't know, because on the one hand, I have hope because there has been, and now I'm going to really put my foot in it. So I think it was the book Coop. I wrote it. That's my memoir about growing up on the dairy farm. And my dad was a very small farmer, and my dad was also a very kind man, a very thoughtful man. He hardly ever had an ill word for anyone. As a matter of fact, as me and my siblings got older, we get impatient with him because he'd say, "Oh, he seems like a pretty good guy." And we're like, "No, he's not a good guy." And it's okay to say that. But he was just a very gentle, thoughtful man. And this was in the early 70s when the Back to the Land movement happened around us. And it was a bunch of alternative folks who showed up. And, for shorthand's sake, at least to us, they appeared to be hippies, and they had 3 farms they bought, and they were all sharing the equipment. It was going to be communal, and they'd go by back and forth around our place, past our farm about 4 times a day with all their gear hooked in one long line, and they're all riding on it, but they were clearly not very efficient. And I just remember the day that my dad, just very quietly, we were watching them go by the farm for the 4th time, and he just quietly said to me, "Yeah, I wonder how long that's going to last." And it didn't, of course. They were lovely folks. We got to know them, but they couldn't make a go of it. But I say that only to say there are a certain amount of people, in my observation these days, who are making a go of it, who are being small and thoughtful and are making a go of it. But, of course, the rub comes in how do you feed millions of people that way. One other thing that none of this feels like it's enough, by the way, just so you don't think I'm wearing rose-colored glasses. But there was one other interesting discussion I had with someone I know who is a farmer and is kind of in between, like got bigger and bigger and is doing it the big way, but is still smaller than the really big guys. And back when, and definitely pro-business, pro-corporate, all that stuff, but back when COVID hit and, we all learned that there are only 4 pork processors, I was talking to him and I said, to me, this is it's never mind food. This is a national security issue. And he just said, "Oh, yeah, absolutely." And it was like, I was kind of surprised that he agreed with me. And, of course, I was putting it in different terms. But I think I would hope there would be some thought to that, too, that, how precarious do we make ourselves when we rely on 2 or 3 or 4 giant systems? But none of this is new. I'm not really breaking new ground here. I think mainly, I certainly am not the solver, and I'm certainly not the guy with the answers. What I'm hoping is that occasionally, with a book like 40 Acres Deep, I can somehow convey the picture from ground level, and also in a way where you don't necessarily come away, or whatever your predisposition is, I hope that maybe you'll also get some insight on the many perspectives that come to bear on these things. I don't know. Everything I'm saying here just feels like, we're getting steamrolled. What can I say? but I also don't believe in cynicism. That doesn't do me any good either. So.
Yeah, I loved, and one of the things we are direly needing and lacking in our world is storytellers, and you are an exemplary example of that. I guess that kind of means the same thing, but I found myself feeling things, reading about this character whose name is Harold, this old farmer, I guess, but really he probably doesn't need to be any older than you or I at this point. And his, he's from the old ways of seeing things, but yet he's not jaded. You somehow were able to explain a very difficult thought process that we think people must go through, but we don't get to see it because people don't share. And I'm thinking of when he goes into the coffee shop, and not only his reaction of being so self-conscious of being in a place where he shouldn't be because he has mud on his boots or whatever, and yet him able to not be offended by certain things and rather, see the beauty of it, even though his instinct is to fear it. Maybe did you I don't know what the question is, but I was amazed at how your characters had some genuine compassion when dealing with intense crisis.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that because it reminds me of a couple of things. First of all, we keep talking about farmers, and obviously the main character is a farmer, and the book is definitely predicated on very specific issues facing farmers. And gosh, since it's come out, I've spoken to several groups, and I've been contacted by ag mental health groups, and I've had some deep, powerfully uplifting correspondence and powerfully sad correspondence. But also wanted Harold to go beyond farming and just sort of, not sort of, I overuse that phrase. I wanted him to be able to convey what so many of us are feeling, no matter what we're doing, and that is that things are just racing on ahead of us, and that things are that there's just powers that be that we just all of a sudden realize this thing isn't ours anymore, and watching people succeed who clearly are devious and insidious, and all those lessons we learned about, being a good citizen. It turns out that maybe the opposite is true if you want to get ahead in their terms. In the end, I don't accept it, because to me it's about honor. And now I'm I'm so self-conscious I'm a complete stumblebum. I make mistakes all the time, and I don't express myself well, and so I don't ever want any of this to come across as me acting like I've got it figured out. But in that coffee shop scene, it's always tricky. People always say, well, is he really you? No, he's not me. He's a fictitious. I made him up. I made that whole book up. But of course you draw on your own experiences. And one of the things that has been my experience from the moment I left, the farm, basically, and then wound up, of all things, being a writer, which was something I never even considered, and wound up going to modern dance recitals and going to New York City and winding up in alternative lifestyle places. And I've often felt out of my element. I've often felt uncomfortable, but I've never felt terrified and angry. I don't understand that, and I'd get impatient with it. I'm okay if you don't, he's struggling too with, am I using the right terminology? But that's not the point. The point is, are you just willing to let someone live their life? Are you willing to be happy for someone else's happiness? And that's something that definitely comes from my own experience, because look, I could say, oh, everything's cool. I'm totally into everything's beautiful. Like, no, man, sometimes I'm still uncomfortable. I'm an older parent, so I've got a 16-year-old, and there are things that she expects me to completely understand and to be able to express in very specific terminology that I'm doing what I can here, but I can't always keep up. But where is my heart? Where are my actions? And that's with him, in that coffee shop. I do wind up in situations where, look, I've traveled all over. I've been to fancy places. But there are places where I just go, yeah, this is not my place. I'm not going to leave, and I'm not going to be rude, and I'm not going to be a jerk. But this is not my place. And he was in one of those places. It's like when I went into my first fancy coffee shop, where I was like, I don't know what a macchiato is, but I'll have one, right? Maybe it's the same. It is a recurring theme in my nonfiction too, where that whole business of, I think in the Montaigne book, book I wrote about Montaigne, the French philosopher guy, I just said, I took my daughters to the Shakespeare play, and then the next night we went to the Demolition Derby. We had a great time both places. We didn't have to get upset about it. We just had a good time, and then we'll reflect on that. And I remember telling my buddies I'd go to see my friend dance, and he was a profoundly out elderly gentleman who did modern dance and wore gold lame to the IGA. And they'd be like, well, I don't know what that's all about. And I said, well, I don't always know what it's about either, but it's beautiful. And guess what? I can still come back and play softball. So I think that was the coffee shop scene. Is I wanted him to be uncomfortable, and I also wanted to make it clear that he's real, in the sense that he didn't just all of a sudden say all the right things. He didn't just all of a sudden say, I celebrate you. He said, I don't know, this kind of confuses me, but I don't understand why it should scare me or make me angry.
Yeah, and he sees the rainbow flag and understands the sort of, he doesn't understand, but he, at the end he kind of throws his hands up and says, or to himself, let love be, we have enough stuff to worry about. Let's not worry about, love, how people do love. It was just a beautiful moment for me reading it.
I appreciate that. You just reminded me of something else, too, to go from the deep to the silly. You did mention, and I'm grateful for it, that there is some humor in the book. Now, it's not the kind of humor that's in my other books where it's some hilarious anecdote, but I tried to put a few things between the lines and even a little humor that just a certain type of person gets. And one of my favorite parts in there, and it is the one I read, when I do readings for this book, I keep it really short. I read about 3 or 4 kind of heavy, give you, set the scene, let you know what's going on. But then I usually close with the part where, and I always set it up by saying, I'm not into making grand pronouncements about the American literary scene, but one thing I state with confidence is that it was my feeling that up until this book, the American literary scene and those who compose it have completely neglected in literature to address the beauty of the kerosene torpedo heater. And so I was like, I'm going to take care of that. And so there's the scene where he's setting up his torpedo heater. And my favorite part is just to read that and listen to the crowds react, because what he does is he gets it set up, and then as he lights it and gets it set, then he looks down, and there's, of course, that decal that's on all of them that says, "Never leave your torpedo heater unattended." And he goes, "Huh," and then walks to the house. Right?
Goes to sleep.
Yeah, it's like we've all done that. And that's a moment where you can convey so much. He's not a careless man. He's a thoughtful man, and he's, frankly, a rule follower. Part of this book is about what happens to the rule followers when the rule breakers, the rule smashers, the rule steamrollers win. But even the rule followers, yeah, listen, let's not get carried away. I'm not sitting here to watch the torpedo heater for the next 4 hours. So it's that kind of humor. I enjoy that. And I enjoy the folks who get that.
Well, there are a lot of those beautiful moments where you really, you took charge of, no one's ever talked about how it feels to pee in the snow, as a guy. That was a beautiful moment, too. Or, the taste of Hungry Jack's, instant potatoes, or, these things that really deserve some remembering and at least some literary representation. I think the book was full of those kind of things, so it felt like you had fun.
I did. There was no one waiting on this, and by the way, I'm a guy who needs an editor. I've proven that in the past. But this was one of those projects where, and I did have an editor on the back end, but more of a copy editor. But it was one of those where I just said, nobody's asked for this book. Nobody's waiting for it. And so I'm going to work on it as long as I want. I'm going to get into it as deep as I want. I'm going to polish it like I used to polish poems back when I thought I was a poet. And so I'm grateful that you've seen that in it. And part of the whole that book, you touched on it already, is he's despairing the loss of the old days, but he's also really on guard about just sitting around despairing the loss of the old days. And they're very early on, he talks about how empty and useless the phrase "the good old days" is, because of course most of us know for a lot of people it wasn't the good old days. And then even if it was your good old days, are you going to just die waiting for that to happen again? And that's personal with me. I've told my wife, lately I've been trying to watch documentaries about writers who were famous, and a lot of the documentaries aren't that good, but it's still helpful for me to watch it, because you're seeing how they were revered in the New York Times Book Review, and they changed the course of American literature. And if you went down the street today and said their name, you'd meet a few people maybe who might remember them. And I've told my wife, for one thing, I don't really have to worry about it. My name is recognizable in certain circles, rarely outside of Wisconsin, but I just don't want to be caught up in that. How do I preserve a legacy when what's really important is to do the work now? And if someone comes across this little novella at some point and recognize themselves in it, or one of their elders, I'm grateful for that, and that's enough.
Yeah, you mentioned, the ubiquitous question of was this you speaking? Was this character? How much of it was based on you? I felt a lot of you in it, not knowing you really well, but knowing you enough through talking philosophy and, that kind of stuff, where there were a lot of philosophical little ins that if you knew, if you had read certain things, you got, like the one that came to mind, I think it was on the 3rd or 4th page, is "Hell is other people." It's one of my favorite.
I think so. One of the reasons I've always wanted to write a novella, because one of the writers who changed the course of my writing life was Jim Harrison. And Jim Harrison was, as we say when we're trying to avoid some things, he was a complicated guy. But his writing quite literally changed the course of my writing career. I read his writing, and we don't have time to get into it today, but there are some very fundamental things he did that changed the way I wrote. And right after that is when I started writing Population 485. And I can go right through that book and show you tricks and techniques. Not tricks is too light a word for what he did, but there are moves in that book that are lifted right from Jim Harrison. But he also wrote lots of novellas, and I always thought, it'd be cool to write a novella someday. And when you read Harrison's work, and if you read his nonfiction and you knew about him, well, of course his characters reflect him. And, of course, Harold reflects some things about me. And, in fact, in fiction, Harold is free to say a few things that sometimes maybe I'm a little too careful about when I'm writing nonfiction. And then I will say, just to keep a little lightness in this. So right about the time this book came out, through a completely unexpected set of circumstances, positive circumstances, I'll stress that because I'm going to shorthand it, but my wife and youngest daughter moved to Boston. It was to pursue an opportunity that was, again, very unexpected. Something the family talked long and hard about, and we made the decision. And, I was just talking with them today. I'm going to go visit them this week. So everything's fine. But that move happened right about the time the book came out. And then this whole book is about a guy questioning what kind of husband he was. And I did get several texts from close friends. And they were these hilarious texts like, hey, man, none of my business, not prying. You don't have to say anything, but I heard, that your wife left, and also this book, I'm like, is that everything cool? I had to say, yeah, no, I'm fine. And I have had, I do have a family history of depression, and I have plenty of anxiety, depression, and I wrote about it in the Montaigne book. But I have never been suicidal. The way I always put it, I have had and do have days where if I saw the bus coming, I'm not sure I'd get out of the way, but I wouldn't go looking for the bus. And so some of what I've experienced in my darkest times did play out through Harold, but not to the extent, more that was more observation. So, yeah, I mean, the husband stuff that, this August, I'll be married 20 years after getting a late start at the age of 39. But I also say, partly as a joke and partly dead serious, when it comes to marriage, the probationary period is perpetual. and so I don't ever, and I look at things that I do in what most would consider, and I consider a solid marriage with someone I respect and admire, and yet I do things sometimes we go, why? What drives you to be that crank? And, he does a lot of that, a lot of looking in the mirror about his own marriage. And it doesn't have to be marriage. I mean, it's any relationship, obviously.
Well, let's talk a little bit about music. I don't want to keep you too long, but you thank in the beginning of the book Sturgill Simpson, and you talk about this song "Mercury in Retrograde," which we'll play later in the show. But
great!
Yeah, have you met him? And where is your musical? Is it is it a compliment to your writing? Do you feel it's a release that is totally different? I mean, artistically, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on a writer who's a musician. They're not that prolific. There's not too many of them.
Yeah, well, boy, a million things come to mind. I don't know if I can keep up with them all. So the first thing is musicians and writing. So when I get asked, who are your greatest writing influences, I already mentioned Jim Harrison, but honestly, my two greatest writing influences were Waylon Jennings and Steve Earle. And because I wasn't thinking about being a writer. I'm a kid I grew up reading literal stacks of books. I started reading at the age of 4. We had no television, couldn't go to movies, and didn't listen to the radio, and very little music. But my mom filled the house with books, and I read voraciously. And yet, as much as I read and as much as I loved books, it just never occurred to a kid cleaning cat pens in rural Wisconsin that I might be allowed to be an author. It just wasn't. It wasn't that no one told me I couldn't. It was just that it wasn't even on the scope of a thought you'd entertain. And when I ran into Waylon Jennings, and then a while after that, Steve Earle, there was this. It was still long before I ever considered being a writer, but it flipped a little switch in me where I went, well, wait a minute. You can be kind of a blue-jeaned roughneck, kind of a working-class guy, and still care about beauty and sound and art and words. And so they really planted a seed. And so I've then, of course, been predisposed to like folks of that ilk for the rest of my life. And when Sturgill Simpson came along and I heard High Top Mountain, actually I heard Meta-Modern Sounds in Country Music first, the one that broke him and made him big. And I just remember a lot of people said, oh, he sounds like Waylon Jennings. That thought never occurred to me. I didn't think he sounded like Waylon Jennings at all. What I thought he sounded like was one of those rare artists who takes an older art form and does it in the older style, and yet it feels utterly contemporary. Mm. And so then I went back and listened to High Top Mountain and felt the same. And then, of course, as we know, Sturge, as I call him, because we're such good friends, I did meet him once, actually. I was part of a music festival that went on for 5 years around these parts, and it was mostly indie artists. Honestly, a lot of acts that were big, but I didn't even know who they were. And I wasn't doing the booking, but I lobbied really hard and won. I said, you need to have this, because this was right when Meta-Modern was kind of catching on. I said, you got to have this guy, Sturgill Simpson. And we got him, and we were so lucky because I think, 6 months later, he wouldn't have darkened our door. But I did meet him. He was backstage with his wife, and he was shot. Things were just exploding, and I could see the weariness in his eyes. And I did the thing that I just walked up to him. I knelt down on one knee. I shook his hand. I said, thank you for your work. It's been very important to me. And I walked away. I didn't try to be his buddy. I didn't talk to him. So no, he has no idea I even exist. But as you know, he could have just ridden that ride, but he just very similar in a way, in a much shorter order, but I think very similar to Steve Earle. He just started going, yeah, I got other things. And so once again, mainstream country doesn't know what to do with him. And so I followed him, and when Sound and Fury came out, I listened to it, and I went, well, good on you for doing that, but it didn't really trip my trigger. And then time went on, and I started working on this book, and then we were all hunkered down during COVID, and I was in my garage writing alone, and just us, me and my family on the farm there. And one night I was working on 40 Acres Deep, and just really waffling on, is this me poking somebody in the eye when I don't need to, or am I assigning myself way too much importance here? No one really cares. And for some reason, I just went and listened to Sound and Fury. I put it on my speakers in that little office there, and all of a sudden, I loved it. I got it. I was like, this is Sturgill going, I don't care if you go see this anime film that goes with this crazy album, that this is what I needed to do right now. And so that's why I thank him, because it was that album, and then, of course, Mercury in Retrograde, where that one line where he just goes, sorry, boys, the bus is plumb full. I mean, what a way to just tell the hangers-on and the latecomers, like, yeah, no, we're good. And so that very specifically is why I thanked him. And the way I thanked him is important, too. I don't remember exactly what I said, but something like he don't need me, but I sure needed him.
Mm. And when did you start playing music?
Oh, man, so this is another thing. Twice now, you called me a farmer and you called me a musician. I always say I really need to point out I'm a writer who lives on a farm that's not really a farm, and I had pigs and chickens for years, and now because I'm living there alone while my family is temporarily away on this little other adventure, I don't even have chickens. It's the first time in 15 years I didn't have chickens because I'm on the road all the time, and I've got great neighbors, but they would like to take care of their own chickens. So, and even when, in Coop, I think I wrote, my wife and I both grew up on hard-working farms, and we knew better when we moved to a farm. We weren't trying to be farmers. We wanted to have some animals and raise our own food. I think there's a big difference. And then I feel somewhat the same about musician. I was in my 30s before I learned my first guitar chords, and then I just started writing songs with the few chords I had and the two rhythms I had, which are still the only two rhythms I have. But I had all these songs. I had about 30 songs, and I had a dear friend, just lost him last year. I didn't lose him, actually. We knew this was coming. He's just on a different adventure, and we stay in touch. But my friend Billy Krause, he found out I had these songs. He said, man, you got to play them out. And I said, oh, no, that's terrifying. And so he booked us into a little coffee shop in Hayward, Wisconsin. I've told this story 100 times, but it's true. We went up there, and the line I always use is, I ain't saying I was nervous, but I cranked out a 60-minute set in 32 minutes flat. But the deal was they invited us back, and the second time there were more people than the first time. And I thought, I'm under no illusions. People initially, if they come to see Michael Perry and the Long Beds, 2 words, by the way, long beds, from the 1951 L120 3/4-ton long bed International Harvester pickup truck I wrote about in the book Truck, A Love Story. But if they come to see me, almost always, it's because they read the books or they heard me on the radio or something, being a writer, and they're like, oh, we'll give it a shot. But once they're there, and we do one cover, and I'll get to that in a minute. We do all original material. So, like, a lot of times I'll get asked by a fire department will get in touch and go, hey, you're a volunteer firefighter. We'd love if you'd come and play our firefighter dance. And there's nothing I would love more. But I have to be frank with them. I just go, hey, just so you know, I play all original material. Nobody's going to want to dance. We aren't going to do Freebird. And you got to get somebody who'll do Freebird. Because I go to those firefighters. I like those dances, and you need a different kind of band for those. But anyways, folks come, and we're just so lucky because they come and they listen. And I have just a crackerjack band, and I can brag on them because they're not me. And I make a point. I don't think there's a show, and when we come to Viroqua in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be playing down in Stoughton also, and then we're going to do a show at the Opera House in Menominee, Wisconsin, and Mabel Tainer. We're out on tour, Eddie. This is the North American tour. Stoughton, Viroqua, and Menominee. We're going to try not to let it change us. But anyways, I just make a real point. The folks on stage with me, they are musicians. I got a bass player that plays world-class jazz. He goes to China and Dubai and places like that to play jazz for people. I've got Mary, my lead guitar player. She plays a Gretsch when she plays with us, but she's also a Telecaster player. She and I are doing some shows as a duo lately. That's been a blast. But man, Mary grew up in Connecticut. Went to Yale, and as soon as she was done at Yale with her American Studies degree, she headed straight for Texas and played lead telly in roadhouses in Texas. And so she's got experiences you can only imagine. And then I have a steel player who's played with all kinds of acts from all over the world. And my guy, Evan, who's my band leader, he plays keys and lead guitar, and when he first joined the band, he said he wanted to get his pilot's license, and now he's flying commercial jets. So we give him a pretty hard time because we're waiting for him to let us use the jet for the North American tour. But my whole point of all this is I just love playing with these folks because I will take the title singer-songwriter. I do write them, and I sing them, and I do the best I can to craft songs that are heartfelt and interesting and somewhat literate but also fun, and I don't mind, I like rhyming stuff. But I am borne along by those musicians, and you will love what you see from them. My favorite part of every show, and I do it several times a show, is that part where we hit the bridge and I just step back.
Yeah.
And because that's what you should see up there. Those folks are musicians. But yeah. The biggest compliment I get after a long bed show is people say, you all look like you're having fun up there, and here's the dirty little secret. We are. We all really like each other. So,
It's a different therapy than writing must be for a character like you.
It is. The biggest thing is I've always said, this is before I ever had a band. I always said I love writing, and no matter what I'm doing, I've been able. And part of this was just survival. I realized unless I sell 1 million books, and that ain't happened yet. As good as things have gone, I'm going to need what we in the corporate world call multiple revenue streams. And so, of course, I got into speaking. Well, I enjoy speaking. It's not a chore, and it's part of how we support our family. My wife and I have a small family business, and it starts with the books, and then I'm speaking, and then the music thing, and that's another way to make a living. And I've been doing some script writing and voiceover work lately, but at the end of the day, none of that happens if I don't sit down at the keyboard and write. And so it all springs from the writing. But I forgot your question. I was going to answer. Oh, what I love about the music is that before I ever did it, I always said my only thing about writing where I envied musicians was 99% of the time, excluding readings and book signings, probably 99.9% of the people who ever partake in the art that you've created, if you're a writer, you're never around when they do it. And musicians, they get to feel the love and adoration in real time, man. And so, yes, it is fun to play the music and actually present the work in real time and have the people there and to feel the room, to feel the reaction. It's a blast. I admit it.
Well, I think you'll really like the Temple Theater. It's one of those beautiful, classic, sort of restored old-time theaters, and you'll sound great there, man. I know you sounded good in the bookstore when you played there, but wow, it's going to sound beautiful at the Temple. What's next?
I just want to. What's next? Oh, okay. I'll hit the what's next. Are you up against a hard break here? Because
I am not. I'm loving talking to you, man.
All right. So let's see. I'll get to the what next part. I wanted to just say, though, your bookstore. So if nobody knows what it is, it's indescribable, really. And I remember playing there with Sean Carey, and just, some rooms don't have a great vibe because they're too square or the acoustics aren't good. I can tell you that if you want great acoustics, it helps to play in a room that is packed with books. But I also wanted to say that I've talked about this in a podcast, I've talked about it online, I've talked about it other times, but, you let me pick a book one time, and I just not randomly, but I picked a book, Montaigne and Mercy. That's not quite the title, but it's about Montaigne and mercy. And, man, that word mercy, I don't know, you used the word compassion already in our interview, and that's one of my favorite words, and I yearn for more compassion, both in myself and for the world. But that word mercy, we're not in a society that really puts a real high value on mercy. And I just thank you for that moment in that book. And that's one of those books there's a stack beside my old green writing chair, which is finally rotting to the point where I'm probably going to have to let it go, even though it was Grandma's.
Throw it in the ditch.
I'm going to have to, I think. But that stack, it rotates, but there's some books that never rotate out. And that book that you let me take, Montaigne and Mercy book, it's still there, and I check into that one on a regular basis. So as far as whatever lies ahead, man, I'm I still got family and mortgage, and so I'm hustling all the time. I have 2 books under contract. I have a book under contract with Source Books about fathers and daughters. That book is currently on hold just because my youngest is 16, and I just think that you shouldn't have your dad writing about you when you're going through those years. So I'm holding off on that one a little bit. And then I'm almost finished. I've been saying this for years, so I hate to even say it in public, but I just signed a contract to promise to turn in the sequel to my book, The Scavengers, by next January. So they're forcing me to do that, which is good because that's what I need. And the book's, it's been about 70 to 80% done for years. I just can't get to it always. I've been doing some voiceover work lately, and that's always fun. I have a Substack, which is actually it's a podcast. If you go to sneezingcow.com and you just scroll down, there's a little post. I think it's dated back in January, but it's called The Quick Summary, and that sort of lets you know where everything stands. And that little podcast I do, it goes out every week, and there's a free version. You can just sign up for it, and you'll just get one about once a month or every 5 weeks. It'll just show up, and that one's free. And then if you want, there is a subscriber version. But that's been a lot of fun because it's just me up in my little room, and I keep them pretty short, and I just kind of talk to folks as if they were all up there in that room with me, and then I usually read an excerpt from something I'm working on or an essay from one of the books. And then I've been out in L.A. a little bit, Eddie.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah.
Had to happen.
I sold a script a while back, and I've got what's called a development deal. And people say, "Oh, what's a development deal?" And I go, "I got no idea, but I've got one." And truth be told, it has turned into what they told me it would turn into, what it's turned into is a phrase I can't use on the air.
Yeah, it starts with C and ends in K.
But the good news is I'm 59 years old, and I'd heard many, many times this is how that goes. So the whole time, every time something goes off the rails, I go, well, they told me it'd be like this. So that's actually been a fun experience. I don't have any news beyond that. And then I'm writing a couple of other projects for some folks out there who are interested, but interested doesn't mean much. It certainly doesn't pay the mortgage. And then I'm just on the road, man. I'm out there speaking. One day I'm speaking at a corporate event, and the next day I'm in the Colby High School talking to a library group, and it's just all over the board. I couldn't be more grateful.
That's so awesome. It's such a beautiful bunch of words that you somehow spit out. Do you do poetry at all, or is it stay away from that, or secret life?
You know what? I don't do a lot of it, and here's why. It's not because I don't want to, but I owe everything to poetry because it was, I mentioned I just came here. I was this kid that just read piles of books, but never occurred to me that I could be an author. And then it's a little more complex than this, but basically I got out of nursing school and I kind of was dabbling a little bit, and a buddy took me to an open mic poetry reading at the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire campus. And I'd never been to such a thing. And this gets back to what I was talking about before, man. I showed up a complete groove, and I'm using that term, and it is the right term in this case. I'd never been to a poetry reading or an open mic. But I just, even then, even though I had a lot of growing to do and a lot of opening up to do yet. But even then, I just remember going, oh, well, this is interesting. I didn't go, creepy poem, dude, or I've never seen someone with hair like that. I was just like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I started writing, and this friend, his name was Frank, man, he took me up to he lived in this little apartment way up on the third or fourth floor of an old lumberman's mansion, and that whole apartment was full of poetry books, and he just started pulling them off the shelf and going, you ought to read this person, you ought to read this person. And then I started writing poetry. Man, for, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years, I worked really hard at poetry and did a ton of open mic readings and published a chap book somewhere in there. I don't know where it is even now. But I always say, only half joking, that I quickly learned 2 things. Number one, I wasn't that great a poet. And number 2, it's really hard to make a living as a poet. And I had at that point decided to try and make it as a freelance writer. And so I've never lost my love for poetry. I still read it all the time. And if anything, I would say, and this maybe takes us back to where the interview started, when I write a book like 40 Acres Deep, I'm trying to sneak my poet in there now and then. And definitely editing that book like I was trying to edit my own poetry and pay attention to rhythm and taste and cadence and all those things. And so, yeah, poetry, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for poetry. And I would hope someday that also I kind of gave us a nice ending there because I brought it all back to 40 Acres Deep. But now I got to say, Jim Harrison, I just the other day online somewhere saw that someone has a photo of the last thing he wrote. And he wrote a lot of poetry. He published a lot of poetry with Copper Canyon Press. And he continued to write and publish poetry even as he did his memoirs and his many novels and novellas. And as I said, towards the end there, he wrote some stuff that was a little hard for me. But that man died writing a poem. And you can see it, the reproduction of that poem that he was working on when he died. And the last two lines, you can see the handwriting start to deteriorate. And they found him dead at the desk. And that ain't bad, Yeah.
Put me down for that one, too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, I'm in no hurry. I'd love to hang around here as long as I'm able and cogent. But if it's got to happen, there's worse ways. So maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. And I also just you've been really good to me, Eddie. I don't know if people know, but behind the scenes and you're one of those folks that it's hard for me. I'm not famous, but I do get more emails than I can answer. I get more heartfelt cards and letters than I can answer. People say more nice things about me than I can ever come back to them in equal measure. But you're one of those people behind the scenes. You've been really good to me, and you don't bug me. We're not pen pals on a regular basis, but you're just one of those solid folks, and you've been there since I first showed up, all shaggy-haired, and I don't forget that. So thanks for talking with me today.
Well, thank you, Michael, and bring a box of those new book down when you come. That would be good. I'll pick one up from you, okay, if you got them.
How about I say this to get right back to being very honest about the multiple revenue streams? Someone once said to me, you should sell your books. So I'm bringing the band to Viroqua, and I hope you can be there. We're going to have a great time. And go to sneezingcow.com, the events page. We have all the details there. But someone once said to me when I was about 3 or 4 years into playing shows with the band, they said, you should sell your books at those concerts. And I said, I thought about that. So you can believe and trust me that there will be a table of every book I've ever published in the lobby available for sale at the music show.
Excellent. I think that's a very smart move, sir.
I will hang around and sign them and shake your hand, too. So thanks again, Eddie. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Michael Perry. We've been talking to from up near Eau Claire, author of many books and writer of many songs, teller of many stories, and a man who really makes your heart glow after reading his works. We're going to go off here playing one of his songs. You have anything to say about the song that goes along with the book, Mike?
Yeah, the song came first. The song is not, the characters are different. The scenario is very similar, and the song came first. And then when it was time to put a title on the book, 40 Acres Deep, I had about 15 titles, a couple of them that I thought were pretty good and powerful, but every time I'd Google them, they were already on Amazon. And so I thought, I came up with that. The line 40 Acres Deep is in the song you're about to hear. And it's a very similar story, but I just thought, well, it's my song. It's my song title. I think I can use it on my book, too. So it's a repurposed title.
Well, we're going to hear 3 minutes of it before the next bit of live music comes in from Studio A. Thank you, Mike, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks at the Temple Theater. Michael Perry and the Long Beds coming to town. Thank you, brother.
Catch you down the road. Thanks.
All right, see you soon.
Tore out 40 foot of barbed wire. He made the sign of the cross and he kept the hammer down. He was ripping through the wheat, there were tears on his cheeks. By the time he shut her down, he was 40 acres deep. Stranded in the kitchen, she was staring at her hand. Ken Deep Denton used to be a wedding band. Broken dishes on the floor, put his fist through the door. The whole work's gone to hell in weeds. 40 acres deep. I don't love you anymore. I don't love you anymore. She was halfway through the letter when the baby cried. Hush, little baby, mama's changed her mind. She put a match to the letter, put the letter to the curtains. As he sows, so shall ye reap. 40 acres deep. Grabbed the gun and racked him up alive once. Hooked a boot heel on the bumper and he leaned against the hood. Bullet for the banker